I used to think silence was weakness. That changed the night my brother threw champagne at my face and smashed my engagement cake in front of everyone I loved. My name is Maren Fielding. I'm 30 years old. The kind of woman people call steady good at my job. Calm under pressure. Always the one to fix what others break. That night, though, nothing in me could fix what cracked open. The hall at Laurelhurst Park glowed under string lights and soft music. I'd spent weeks choosing the colors pale gold and sage, and for a few precious minutes, everything looked perfect. Daniel, my fiancé, squeezed my hand as our friends lifted glasses to toast. Then Ellis staggered forward, unsteady, his face red and eyes wet. "You think you're better than us," he said, the words sliced through the hum of laughter. Before I could move, he raised his glass and threw it. Champagne sprayed across my face, cold and sharp. Gasps followed, chairs scraping back, someone dropping a fork. Ellis reached for the cake table, shoving it hard enough to send the top tier sliding to the floor. My mother screamed his name. My father caught his arm. And then, just like always, they turned toward him. "Not me. He's just upset," my mother said, cradling his shoulders while he muttered curses into her dress. Daniel's voice brushed my ear. "Let's go." I nodded, though my feet wouldn't move. Frosting streaked my shoes. The scent of champagne clung to my hair. Around us, the music had stopped. No one spoke. The silence pressed heavy, like fog after thunder. I didn't shout or cry. I just stood there, realizing it wasn't a sudden storm. It was every quiet imbalance of my family made visible at last. I was 15 the first time I handed my mother a stack of cash and watched her eyes fill with relief. It was $80 from my weekend shifts at a cafe 2 blocks from our house. The antique shop my parents ran had been slow that winter, too many rainy days, too few customers, and the electric bill was overdue. "Just until next month," she'd said, folding the bills like something fragile. But next month turned into every month, after school. I'd pull on an apron that smelled of coffee grounds and cinnamon, wiping tables until dark. My father would pick me up sometimes, silent except for the low hum of the truck heater. "You're a good kid, Maren," he'd murmur, never quite looking at me. I held onto those words as if they were payment. Ellis was 6 then, all freckles and energy, chasing soccer balls through the muddy park. When he scored a goal, my parents clapped like it was a miracle. I used to take photos of him from the sideline, proud in my own quiet way. But I noticed how every triumph of his meant a bill of mine postponed. "He's still a kid, you're the responsible one," Mom would remind me, and the words settled like a rule written in stone. By the time I turned 17, I was paying for groceries, new tires, even Ellis's birthday presents. At first, I told myself it was temporary. We were a family. Families helped each other. But when I left for college on a partial scholarship, the calls didn't stop. My father's voice came through the dorm payphone, gentle, apologetic. "Could you send a little just to cover the gas this week? So I mailed envelopes 50 here, 100 there, watching my savings thin while Ellis's new cleats gleamed in photos, somewhere between semesters and part-time shifts. I stopped being the daughter and became the safety net. Pride kept me going. So did love. But even then, beneath the duty, something inside me began to ache for balance I couldn't yet name. Ellis's lies began as small things: missing change from my mother's purse, homework mysteriously lost, test papers blamed on teachers who didn't like him. My parents always had an answer ready. "He's just sensitive," my mother would say, brushing his hair from his forehead. "You know how boys are," my father added, as if that excused everything. I stopped arguing. Every time I tried, it turned into a lecture about patience. I was told to set an example, to be understanding. So, I learned to swallow my frustration and study harder, as though perfection could fix what love had twisted. By the time Ellis hit high school, the pattern was set. When he got caught skipping class, Mom blamed his friends. When he dented Dad's truck, Dad blamed the icy roads. There was always someone else at fault, never Ellis. He knew it too. I saw it in the way he'd look at me half smirk, half dare when they defended him. After graduation, he enrolled in community college. I was already working full-time at a data firm in Portland, and before I could think, I was paying his tuition, just until he finds his footing. Mom promised. The next month, I covered his car insurance, then the deposit on a small apartment across town. It was easy to justify. I told myself I was helping him become independent, but independence never came. Entitlement did. One Friday evening, I stopped by his place to drop off a few grocery bags. The door was open, laughter spilling out. Inside, he sat with two friends, a beer in hand. I caught my name mid-sentence. Yeah, Marin's basically my personal ATM. He joked, grinning wide. The room erupted in laughter. I forced a smile from the doorway, pretending not to care, pretending to be the cool sister who didn't take things too seriously. We talked for a minute small, meaningless talk before I left. In the car, the laughter followed me. I sat in the dark for a long time, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel until they ached. I'd given him everything I had, and somehow, it had only taught him how easy it was to take. The offer letter arrived on a gray April morning, printed on crisp paper that smelled faintly of ink and promise. $80,000 a year. Benefits. A parking space. It felt unreal, like all the late-night studying. The skipped outings, the endless shifts had finally pulled me to solid ground. I walked along the Willamette River that evening with a cup of coffee, letting the cold wind remind me that I'd earned this life for a few weeks. Pride felt clean. Then the calls started. Just alone. "Sweetie," my mother said one night, her tone soft as always. "The shop's behind on taxes again, and your father's trying his best." I wired the money before bedtime. It wasn't much, just enough to stop the panic in her voice. But soon, there was another call. Ellis's tuition was due. The rent on the antique shop had gone up. The credit card interest was higher than expected. Each favor arrived wrapped in guilt, and I was too used to saying yes to remember that I could say no. When I bought myself a small used car, a dented blue Corolla that smelled faintly of someone else's cigarettes, Ellis called to say he needed one too. I found a beat-up sedan for $3,000, sent the transfer, and told myself it was an investment in his future. The first month of freedom disappeared into their debts. My bank app showed more withdrawals than deposits. Yet, every time my balance dipped, Mom's voice carried that familiar sigh. Family helps family. At work, my colleagues talked about weekend getaways and furniture upgrades. I smiled and nodded, thinking about the antique shop's flickering lights and the unpaid invoices stacked on my parents' counter. My success had somehow become a shared resource divided into monthly installments of obligation. Still, I clung to the hope that it was temporary, that once things stabilized, they'd see I wasn't just a safety net but a daughter worth celebrating. Yet deep down, even as I stayed late at the office, chasing promotions and security, I felt the quiet truth settling in my family. Affection was measured by how much I could afford to give. I met Daniel at a tech conference in Seattle, 2 cities and 1 decade removed from the life I was still trying to outgrow. He was giving a talk about network integrity, something I barely understood, but his calm voice cut through the usual noise of ambition and jargon. Later, we ended up at the same coffee line, laughing about the terrible sandwiches they served at professional events. His laugh was low and unforced, the kind that made you forget to guard your words. He lived in Seattle, working as a network analyst for a mid-size firm. I was still in Portland, building systems for healthcare clients. Our conversations started as emails about code and deadlines, then grew into something more personal. He admired that I was so grounded. I didn't tell him that grounding myself was just another word for carrying everyone else. The first time I brought him home, it was supposed to be simple dinner at my parents' house, a quiet introduction. Daniel brought flowers, and I made a casserole. My father barely looked up from the antique clock he was repairing. My mother took the flowers without meeting his eyes. "He's very polished," she said later in the kitchen. Her voice dipped in suspicion. "Be careful with men like that. They leave when life gets messy." Ellis arrived halfway through dinner, smelling faintly of beer and mockery. "So you code for fun money?" he asked Daniel, grinning like it was a joke. Daniel smiled politely. I tried to laugh it off, the way I always did, but something shifted inside me watching the ease with which they dismissed him as if he were trespassing in a home I had already paid for 100 times over. On the drive back, silence filled the car. I stared out at the passing headlights, replaying every condescending word. Daniel finally spoke, gentle but firm. "Why do you let them talk to you like that?" I didn't know how to answer. Loyalty had long ago tangled itself around guilt until I couldn't tell them apart. He reached over, resting his hand on mine, steady and warm. "You don't owe anyone your peace," he said quietly. But I did owe them, or at least I thought I did, and that belief would take years, and a public humiliation, to finally burn away. Daniel proposed on the Hawthorne Bridge just as the sky burned orange over the river. The wind tangled my hair, and his hand trembled when he opened the small velvet box. I didn't even let him finish the sentence. I just said yes, through tears and laughter and the sound of a passing bike bell. For once, the future felt light, not something to carry. The next night, we drove to my parents' house for dinner. I had imagined smiles, questions about the date, maybe even a toast. Instead, my mother barely looked up from the roast chicken. "Weddings are expensive," she said, her tone flat. "Don't expect help. Things are tight right now." My father nodded without meeting my eyes. Across the table, Ellis leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Guess the tech guy finally bought you," he said, swirling his drink. Daniel's hand tightened around mine under the table. I managed a small laugh, pretending the words didn't land where they did. The conversation stumbled through the meal, my parents talking mostly to Ellis, asking about his classes and his new business ideas. When Daniel tried to join in, my father changed the subject to the rising rent downtown. I sat there smiling, feeling smaller with every passing minute. On the drive home, Daniel was quiet until we reached the bridge again. "You don't owe them explanations," he said softly. I nodded but didn't answer. Old reflexes die hard. A week later, Ellis texted me, "Hey, rent's due. Can you spot me $600? I stared at the message for an hour before transferring the money. Habit, not kindness. It felt easier than confrontation. At work, my colleagues congratulated me, admiring the ring. I smiled, thanked them, and said nothing about how my family hadn't even called since dinner. I kept waiting for a sign that they'd come around, a note, a question, anything. But silence can be an answer too. Somewhere beneath the numbness, something small shifted, a truth beginning to rise. Quiet but steady. They were never proud of me unless I was the one holding them up. 3 weeks before the engagement party, Ellis called while I was leaving work. His tone was light, almost cheerful, the way it always was when he wanted something. "Hey, so I found this suit," he began, "custom tailored. I need to look good in the photos. Right. You can cover it." Yeah, I paused on the curb, the city humming around me. How much I asked, though I already regretted it. "Only $2,800. It's an investment. You'll want your brother to look sharp." I laughed softly, hoping he'd catch the hint. "Ellis, that's almost my rent." He didn't flinch. "You can afford it. You owe me for living in your shadow all these years." The words landed heavier than he knew. I told him no, gently but firmly. There was a silence, then the click of a call ending. That night, my mother called. "He's just embarrassed," she said, her voice syrup-sweet but laced with guilt. "Help him feel included. Marin, he's your brother." I stared at the ceiling, phone pressed to my ear. Mom, I'm paying for the venue, the catering, the flowers. Daniel and I are already stretched. Family comes first, she replied, like scripture. When I hung up, Daniel was sitting by the window, laptop closed. He'd heard everything. You can't keep fixing people who enjoy breaking things, he said quietly. I wanted to argue, to defend them, to remind him that families were complicated. But all I could do was sit beside him, feeling the truth in his words. Later, I checked my phone's 6 unread messages from Ellis, each one more manipulative than the last. You've changed. You think you're better now. Don't forget who helped you when you had nothing. I turned the screen face down and climbed into bed. The room was still, but my mind spun. I thought of all the years I'd spent cushioning his failures, softening our parents' worries, writing checks that bought temporary peace. Daniel reached for my hand under the blanket. I didn't speak. Somewhere inside, I knew something was shifting. I'd built my family's comfort on silence, and for the first time, I wasn't sure I could afford it anymore. The evening should have been perfect. The garden at Laurelhurst Park shimmered under strings of light, and the air smelled faintly of lilac and champagne. Daniel's laugh carried over the music as friends toasted, the sound of glasses clinking against summer dusk. For a moment, I let myself believe it would stay peaceful. Ellis arrived late, already unsteady, his tie crooked and eyes glassy. He hugged our mother with exaggerated affection, ignored Daniel's outstretched hand, then grabbed a bottle from the bar. I felt the familiar warning rise in my chest, but forced a smile, pretending not to notice the way guests exchanged nervous glances. When he stood to make a toast, my stomach tightened. To my sister, he began, slurring slightly. The family success story, the one who left us all behind. Laughter rippled uneasily, waiting for the punchline that never came. He raised his glass higher. You think you're better than us? Marin. But this? He swung the bottle, spraying champagne in my direction, droplets catching the light like glitter before crashing cold against my face. This is what you get. The crowd froze. Then came the crash of the cake table, the gasp, the clatter of silverware. I stood there, dress heavy with frosting and humiliation, while my parents rushed toward him. My mother stroked his hair as he cursed under his breath. He's just overwhelmed, she whispered. Daniel moved beside me, his jaw tight. But before I could step away, my father's voice cut through the murmurs. At least we covered Ellis's car from her honeymoon fund. It landed like a blow. I turned slowly, searching their faces for denial, but none came. Just silence and the sound of someone sweeping broken glass into a dustpan. $10,000 gone. My parents calm. Ellis's smirk, the stunned faces around us, all of it blurred. I reached for Daniel's hand. Without a word, we walked through the open doors into the night air. The music had stopped, but the echo of what was broken stayed with me. My silence was no longer surrender. It was the only language left that told the truth. The morning after the party, I woke before sunrise, the taste of champagne still bitter on my tongue. My head felt clear in a way it hadn't in years. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. The first thing I did was cancel every automatic transfer Ellis's rent, his tuition payments, the small monthly deposits I sent to my parents' shop. Then I called the bank and closed the joint account my mother had convinced me to open for emergencies. I rerouted my paycheck to a new account under my name only. My phone buzzed nonstop. Missed calls from Mom, then Dad, then Ellis. I didn't answer. Around noon, a text came through. You'll regret this. A week later, they showed up at my apartment. I saw them through the glass door of the lobby, Mom in her familiar floral scarf. Dad behind her. Ellis pacing like a caged animal. I pressed record on my phone before stepping closer. Tuition's due, my father said, as if nothing had happened. "You can't just cut us off like this. You took my honeymoon savings," I said evenly. "We're finished." My mother's eyes filled, her voice trembling. "You're being dramatic. Marin, it was for your brother's future." I held the phone steady. "No, it was for mine." They left after 10 tense minutes, Ellis muttering that I'd turned heartless. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like freedom. At work, I tried to focus, but my hands shook when I typed. Daniel found me in the break room, a paper cup of tea in his hand. "It feels wrong, doesn't it?" he said quietly, like breaking a law of nature. I admitted. He smiled faintly. "Maybe you're writing a new one." That night, I blocked their numbers. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was peace, fragile but finally mine. By the time winter turned to spring, the noise around me had faded. Daniel and I moved into a small craftsman house near Mount Tabor, its porch framed by climbing jasmine and the faint hum of the city below. It wasn't grand, but it was ours. We spent weekends sanding old floors, painting the kitchen a pale green, learning how to build something that didn't demand constant repair. I started a mentorship program at work, a side project for young women in tech who were balancing school, jobs, and families. Some reminded me of the girl I used to be, tired, hopeful, always reaching for stability that seemed just out of reach. Each scholarship I signed off on felt like reclaiming a piece of what I'd lost. News about my family came in fragments. A former neighbor mentioned that Ellis was back working at the antique shop, struggling to keep up with bills. I felt sympathy but no guilt. My parents never called. But one morning an envelope arrived with my mother's handwriting. "Hope you're well." No return address, no apology. I set it in a drawer and left it there, untouched, but not resented. On warm evenings, Daniel and I sat on the porch with our laptops closed and our phones inside. The air smelled of rain and lilacs. The streetlights blinked on, one by one. I lifted a glass of champagne, the good kind this time, poured by my own hand. For the first time, the quiet didn't ache. It didn't demand explanation or apology. It simply existed, soft and steady, like breath. I looked out over the neighborhood roofs glowing under twilight and whispered, half to myself, half to the life I'd finally chosen. Silence isn't weakness, it's peace.